The rich get richer as Brendan Morrow has waived his no-trade clause for a deal to the Pittsburgh Penguins. It's a Morrow-for-Morrow trade as Brendan goes to the Pens. Joe Morrow goes to the Stars with a few draft picks involved. Scott Burnside, NHL writer for ESPN.com, joins us with more insight. And he's only 2 years removed, Scott, from a 33-goal season, which was a career high. What will Brendan Morrow add to the Pens?
Well, I mean, Brendan Morrow brings, the oft sought after at this time of year intangible, right? He's a captain. He was a member of the Canadian Olympic team that won a gold medal in Vancouver in 2010. He brings a lot of grit to his game. Obviously, as you mentioned, he had 33 goals a couple of years ago, so he has some offensive upside. Those numbers have declined. He's been nagged by injury, certainly last year. He's only got 6 goals thus far this year. But to me, he's a guy who fills in around the edges. He's the kind of player, maybe it's only 1 or 2 or 2 or 3 goals during a long playoff run, but Brendan Morrow is the kind of guy who can deliver important minutes at important times for a team that is looks very much like a team that should go on a long playoff run starting in early May.
Scott, some would say if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This is a Penguins team that's won their first 11 games to start the month of March. They have 114 goals scored. So why add another piece to the puzzle right now when they're going so well?
Well, again, it's all about the depth, because when you look at the teams that have won the Stanley Cup over the last 4 or 5 years, whether it's Boston or Pittsburgh, Los Angeles Kings, Chicago Blackhawks, there are teams that have had tremendous depth up and down the lineup. Whether it's along the blue line, whether it's up front in terms of guys who can step into different roles, whether it's penalty killing, whether it's a shutdown situation, whether it's stepping in as a second power play unit guy. Brendan Morrow is the kind of player who can do all of those things. He's also a leader. He's a guy who's been there at high-level games, on big stages. He's the kind of guy that I also think won't disrupt things in a dressing room. He's not a guy with a huge ego. He's not a guy who's going to come in and demand to play 25 minutes or demand to play with Sidney Crosby. Whatever Dan Bilesman, the head coach of Pittsburgh, wants Brendan Morrow to do, he's going to do. And I think it's one of those glue kind of additions. And on the surface, it looks like a nice ad for a team that already has a lot going for it.
These are two teams right now in different places. The Pens tops in the East, the Stars hanging on to that 8th spot in the Western Conference. Now, Joe Morrow was a former first-round pick of the Penguins. Looking long-term in this sense, what will Joe Morrow bring for the Stars?
Well, Joe Morrow is the 23rd overall pick in the 2011 draft. The Penguins are lucky. They're one of the few teams operating from a position of strength in terms of their defensive depth. They have a lot of good young defensive prospects coming up through the system, so they can afford to let go a former first-round pick. What Joe Morrow represents to the Stars is really futures. You go back a couple of years ago, they had Brad Richards, pending unrestricted free agent. The Stars, as they are now, a bubble team, straddling the fence between getting in and not getting into the playoffs. They decided to stay with Brad Richards, missed the playoffs on the last day of the regular season. Brad Richards walks away as an unrestricted free agent in July. I think this is more a preemptive move, looking at the future, saying, Joe Newendike, the GM, saying, listen, we're not going to let an asset like Brendan Morrow walk away from us should he decide to do so in July. We're going to add, we're going to build for the future, and I think that's what you're seeing here. It'll be interesting to see what Joe Newendike does. He's got a couple of other players in similar situations, in Derek Roy and Jaromir Jagr. Does he also entertain offers for those guys, or does he hang on to them and hope that the Stars sneak into the playoffs? Lots of interesting decisions for Joe Newendike moving forward, but he certainly adds a good young defensive prospect in Joe Morrow. For Brendan Morrow, a player that wasn't likely to return to the Dallas Stars after the summer.
Scott Burnside covers the NHL for ESPN.com. Scott, thanks for the insight.
Anytime.
You can read more about this Morrow for Morrow trade right here on ESPN.com. With the latest ESPN headlines, I'm Jim Basquill.